Welcome to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Designed for everyone interested in responsible stewardship of the planet, covering food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, Technologies and Paradigms to Shape a World That Works. I'm Mira Rubin, your host, and I am so delighted to introduce you today to Adina Popescu. Adina is the founder of ÆRTH, a planetary AI that connects the data from its global ocean science network with satellite observations to create a live data set on ocean health, making the emergence of dynamic AI-driven ecosystem models possible. Adina comes to this audacious, visionary project as a trained philosopher and technologist. She's served as an advisor to the Apple Media Arts Lab, as well as Conservation International, on the future of both virtual and augmented reality, and organizations such as Paramount Studios and McKinsey on the exploration of immersive technologies. A voice of insight and wisdom, Adina has lectured extensively on ethics in relation to the future of AI, deep tech, and privacy-preserving protocols. Adina, I'm so delighted to welcome you. Hello, hello. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Mira, for having me. Really excited.
Me too, me too. What you're doing is unprecedented. You're trying to create a map of global ecology, starting with the ocean. And uh, it's just such an audacious vision that it really, truly leaves me speechless. I'd love to start by you talking about how you even came up with that vision, and then we'll talk more about the organization and how it's emerging.
Sure, of course. Well, it's been actually quite a while in the making, as you know. It's been a long journey. I think it started with being astounded that that doesn't exist yet. So I was under the impression, I remember I was a student still. I was in this, I was doing philosophy in New York, and out of some total coincidence, I ended up advising Peter Seligman, who's the chair of the board of Conservation International back then. We talked about virtual reality and augmented reality and how we can use this for empathic storytelling to make, palpable to people how the Amazon is degrading, how fisheries are disappearing, what that means for a little boy who's depending on fisheries and his family in Papua, I think it was. And this is a long time ago, in 2015, I think. And I remember asking, well, now we show how everything is degrading, but do we actually have data-driven models that can show us how to best regenerate? How, data-driven models of bioregional ecosystems and what they need in order to be stable. And I just assumed, I don't know why, I thought we have so much data on everything else, on our cat videos and statistics. How do we not have data on our most crucial ecosystems? And when I learned that actually, yes, we do have satellites, yes, we do have sensors, but we actually haven't really mapped bioregional ecosystems in depth as interconnected systems, which means to have data and knowledge from what the satellites cannot see, which is coastal systems, oceans, soil. Yes, and so we set up to map that.
And so you started this in 2015.
I started thinking about this in 2015, and then I really started this in 2017. And I'll be brutally honest, I usually don't tell people how long this has been in the making, but it was 2017 that I was on stage at a tech conference in Berlin called Tech Open Air, and I was standing on stage presenting the idea of doing interconnected modeling of ecosystems, like living systems modeling. And I thought back then in 2017 that if I present this, everyone who's a specialist in this is going to come to me and we're going to do this together. Nothing happened. And it took until 2021 until JT Rager from NASA JPL called and said, we need this data to train our satellites on, because satellites don't know if you know, like it's really hard to tell even from satellites if something is phytoplankton or oil. You need context. You need somebody on the ground that tells you that green thing, when it turns yellow, that's bad, right? You need in situ, on the ground data to train satellites to know what they're looking at. And that's when, in 2021, that's when things started speeding up.
It's actually not that long ago. I mean, if you think about it, it's rather remarkable at how quickly this is evolving. I know it doesn't feel that way because it's been a heroine's journey along
Yes.
the way. I'm wondering, before we get more deeply into it, can you just explain what is happening with Earth and ÄRTH? It's the reason we're pronouncing it that way is I don't know the name of that character that is the combined A and E, but the name of the organization is spelled AERTH.
Yeah.
So tell us where you are with this and what's the vision and how is this a vehicle for actual restorative work on the planet?
Yes. Well, I think we're seeing, I think we're very much in line with a lot of breakthroughs that we're seeing everywhere else in the world, where you actually, where people start understanding that we cannot have siloed data or siloed research. So we see that in the medical field and how breakthroughs are happening now because people are creating unified standards for data, so that actually people can start sharing all this medical data from all different repositories. And there's a second thing that's happening, which is, of course, machine learning becoming exponentially more effective and intelligent, meaning that now we also understand that we need to have the data in one place. The data needs to be organized, data needs to be linked, so that actually we can use machine learning in a much more effective way on data that has otherwise been spread out, but somehow belongs together and needs to speak to each other. And so we see that in the medical field, we see that in, you know, genetic, genome decoding, protein folding. We see that everywhere, but we actually haven't introduced that yet for environmental ground data. All the environmental ground data is basically still managed by oceanographic institutions that are funded again by their governments. Everybody has their own way of storing the data. You know, different languages on how basically the data is, or you know, most of the data is not even cleaned or normalized. So most of the work that I have been doing is actually diplomacy and human work, which is actually to go to those ocean institutions, to go to the directors, to speak with the faculties, and to say, okay, how is it possible that even within faculties you're not necessarily sharing the data? Why is that? What are your concerns? And I have learned so much along the way. You need to start listening to people, like, right? Like, why did the Bahamas just decide that you can't even take a small water sample from the Bahamas and bring it somewhere else? And I've learned that is because ground data is very valuable, because it is relevant for national security, because it's ultimately is an indicator on the resources of those places. Then I've also learned that scientists have a hard time opening, maybe sharing their research, because they often don't get quoted, or other people come and just steal their research and they don't get quoted, right? So there's a lot of sensitivities around ground data that we needed to create a full protocol and actually incentives to get everybody on board to want to share their data. So this has actually been the work that really took that long, is actually, how do we bring people together that have to one table, sharing the data in a linked, constantly updating way.
It's really quite a social experiment, and I'm sure your philosophy background really came very richly into play in this development. I'm curious, what were the greatest obstacles? You said that ownership of data and trust factor, but you said you set up a system of trust that enabled people and organizations to participate in this. What were some of the parameters, I guess, that you established? Because I think it'll give us a rich insight into human beings. and how we operate. I'm very curious.
Mira, unfortunately, it's exactly the thing that we cannot disclose here right now because you know that we're gearing up for a large raise. And
Okay.
it is the incentives that it is ultimately, you know, the trick is never in the technology itself. People are always thinking, oh, the technology is hard. The human element is hard. And the way how we have actually figured out to bring people together and how to create a protocol that is incentivizing everybody is in a way our secret sauce at the moment.
I love it. But I'm wondering if there's a way to talk about it, not by talking about the specifics, but by talking about the philosophical elements of what you learned about human beings and creating bridges.
Mhm.
Because I think that that knowledge is essential for all of us going forward. And it sounds like you probably have a unique insight into that without giving us the specifics of the incentives.
Sure. So here's what I've learned. Scientists always want to collaborate. Scientists are very mission-driven people. They're very knowledge-driven people. And scientists generally want to collaborate across the board. So what I've learned, for example, by speaking to people at NASA JPL who told me, look, we have an okay wildfire models, but those wildfire models are not very good at predicting wildfires. Why, you know, but so if we could actually work with other groups in other countries that have their own wildfire models and we would put them together, we would get somewhere much, much faster. So I think it's the nature of how we have set up the world by the idea of countries having secrets, companies competing with each other's, countries competing with each other's, that doesn't really work when you actually want to solve global challenges. And the ocean connects all those countries with each other, right? So you can be the greatest in ocean protection, but if the country one further up the coast is dumping nuclear waste into their sea, it will still affect you. And I think this is where our systems are still very much based on competition instead of collaboration. And so this is something that we have worked on solving by using technology that makes people feel safe, so that they actually are more willing to share.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to your after your big raise so that we can get more specifics about how you tackled this seemingly insurmountable problem or challenge. But the organization's called Earth or ÆRTH.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is that you're focusing on the oceans. And I'd like to talk about why oceans and how does that fit into the larger vision for the future also?
Yes. I mean, the vision is very big, obviously, and let's see how, when we're going to get there. But I think the idea is that we are living in a fully interconnected intelligence system, and we are not separate from that system. We're actually part of that system. Our entire organism is part of the cycle of this system. And only recently, I think with more, that it became more public how mycelium networks work, with a deeper understanding of how maybe, like a coastal system through the erosion of the coast is going to affect the farmland. So the ocean and coastal health is actually affecting farmland. We start to understand how everything is so connected. And yet in the way that people are still organizing conferences or putting you in bucket lists, you're either in the ocean space or you're doing soil, where humans always like still separate those systems from each other. So if you want to stay true to doing ecosystem modeling, you need to actually model all spheres, which is the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere. Right now, we have very good models for atmosphere, which is weather models, atmospheric models, monitoring CO2 in the atmosphere, methane, seeing how basically weather patterns and heating is happening. What we haven't really done is to map that now onto the ground. And for that, you actually need ground data, which is what we're aggregating. You need on the ground data to now see how that climate model that you have created that predicts X, Y, Z, you know, degrees of global warming, how that affects a certain region. And that's when we're speaking about climate adaptation. You cannot really model climate adaptation, which is the biggest topic in the UN and with the NDCs right now, is how do we actually fund the most fragile, most affected countries in the global south that are affected by climate change, if we actually don't put the data models together so that they can actually model how to adapt to the newfound and changing conditions. And this is what we're enabling. So it is an ambitious vision in terms of really trying to link what for now has been separate.
It's an insanely audacious vision. And I just, I'm in awe. I'm really, truly in awe at the scope of your vision, and so grateful that you've had the perseverance to move through all these remarkable hurdles that you've encountered. I know that the foundation right now that you're building is built on creating a data consortium, an ocean data consortium. And so the question was, why start with the oceans? And I think that in our previous conversation, you mentioned that that's where there's data. That's where we can find a bunch of data.
You know what it is? We have data on everything, but the data needs to be organized in some way and somehow scientifically vetted. That is very important to us. And the ocean space already through 50 years or longer of every country funding an ocean institute and basically monitoring its own coast. So every country that has a coast is doing that already. So we are already tapping into existing structures of scientific data and research, while when you work with the Amazon rainforest, when you work with soil, when you work with farmers, it is much more challenging, as everybody knows who's trying to do the same for soil health and working with small farmers, etc. It's very important work that needs to be done. It's just harder. So we started with the ocean because that's where the data is already organized.
And what you were doing is creating a universal language, essentially, to cross over, what was it, 20 different organizations? Or how many organizations with ocean data?
Eventually 20. It was the hope spots, I think, that you're thinking of. Eventually 20 or more. I mean, honestly, I think it can be eventually 100. But we are starting now with approximately 8, and 5 of them are at major coasts from Brazil, Australia, Panama, Gambia, Mexico.
Wow. So one of the things that there's so many things racing through my mind right now, but one of the things is that we have such a I think we've been conditioned a bit to a fear of AI, with the apocalyptic visions of what AI is going to do to destroy all of humanity. What you're presenting here is a really rich, wonderful, optimistic use of AI and artificial learning and these learning models, and how they can help us to become what another person I spoke to, it was beautiful, talking about human beings being a keystone species, but in the finest sense. And these tools can enable us to support nature in its processes and in its regeneration. How did you become so knowledgeable about AI and virtual reality? And because you've spoken about that and the ethics of it, I'm curious about that background.
That's a really hard one to answer because it was always, I don't know why, I always said it was never hard for me to understand these technologies. And it's odd because I'm a philosopher, so I actually didn't study data science.
Wow.
And so I just taught myself. I'm self-taught in this, and usually but also to be clear, I'm not the CTO, I still need to work with the CTO, and I still need to, of course, it needs an army of engineers and data scientists who are like way more knowledgeable than I. But I think I have a good understanding of how technology works. And I have a very good feeling of, I have a good understanding how the next 5 years can look like. Now we're living in such a rapid time that I think it's only 2.
So
times are changing. Yeah, times are changing. Like when I was advising on virtual and augmented reality, it was pretty easy for me to have like a good 5-year sense of development and how all the technologies are merging and what the potential is going to be from those technologies, how they're going to be applied. Now the horizon is getting shorter and shorter just because the changes are so rapid. I am a big fan of going forward and not backward. I think once the cat is out of the bag, what are you going to do? Like you can't, like it's one thing is to be sentimental. But the truth is things are changing, and they're changing all the time. And it's always the intergenerational conflict, right? Things are speeding up, new technologies are coming in. I really believe that it is in the hands of humanity and the consciousness that humanity has, if those tools are going to dominate them, or if they are actually just going to use those tools to get to their highest potential. And it's really up to humanity to actually, I think, I could use those tools to extract information for extractive purposes of nature. And I'm not doing that, right? So I think it is really up to each of us how we're using those tools. And maybe that's where personal responsibility comes in. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, if I'm not doing it, somebody else is doing it. But that's not really an argument. Like people who say that, I don't even know how to have a conversation with them any further, right? Everybody has a responsibility to shape the future, especially in a time of accelerated tools that can really create so fast a new reality for so many people. And
what do you see for the next 2 years? You just said the horizon, you see 2 years down. I'm curious.
Oh man, just about machine learning, just about AI. I'm going to say some things now, but okay. Right now, what we're seeing is still a very siloed approach. There's a lot of different ways to approach machine learning, maybe a transformer model, causal inference models. There's just like so many different ways to create machine learning models. And I think right now we're living in a hype time, similar to how WeWork was hyped or virtual reality was hyped. It's a time of hype. I don't think that the dominant companies right now are going to necessarily stay the dominant ones. And I think what we're going to see is much more interpolation or intrapolation between those tools, and we'll start understanding how they're all part of a layer cake to achieve certain results. We are most likely going to see how our financial and in our capital investment thesis and the way that we actually currently invest into companies is not going to work any longer. I think that AI is going to push us to the limit of how we have thought about ownership, owning equity in a company, when you actually train models that are trained on multi-stakeholder data. We need to actually create more circular economies with more revenue share models that drive back the proceeds to every part of the ecosystem and not just to some. So we are going to be forced to actually do business in a much more collective, intelligent way, in a much more distributed way. I believe the distributed systems are on the rise. Centralized, siloed systems are not going to be able to hold up. And everybody who's still trying to create a little black box and control their own revenue generation, it's not going to work with those AI tools, which actually in return is going to really shift the world and in the understanding of how we actually do business across countries. Countries are going to become less relevant, and I think big corporations are going to become less relevant because of the agility of how those tools are going to accelerate the way we transfer knowledge with each other and do business with each other. So I think it's positive.
Fascinating, fascinating. We're going to bookmark this to come
I've
back.
never said that anywhere in the world, by the way.
Thank you so much for that. Really, I'm putting a pin in it to come back to. I really appreciate that. So I want to get back to what you're actually doing with ÆRTH. And you talked about partnering in some capacity with Mission Blue and hope spots, talking about hope spots, which from what you said to me, sound to me like acupuncture points, planetary acupuncture points in the ocean that are essential to global health. Is that, would you consider that that's an accurate rendition of what you were explaining?
Yes, I think that the person to speak about that is Dr. Sylvia Earle, who actually has, created those hope spots. She has created the notion of a hope spot. She has identified the hope spots. And she's also the founder of Mission Blue. And we are currently in conversations with them, hoping to partner, just because I find her approach so admirable. And I think it's also very smart because every ecosystem has stabilizing factors, right? Because if everything is connected, you need to understand which parts of ecology, when they hit a tipping point, they create cascading and ripple effects that basically take all the other coral systems down with them, right? So where are the acupressure points, as you said, that we have to stabilize? It's the same with the Amazon corridor. There's like calculations that basically say, hey, if we can stabilize the Amazon corridor, which is also the corridor where the jaguars are traveling through all, the entire Amazon, if we can stabilize the corridor, it's almost like a core piece that holds everything together.
Kind of like geographic keystone species.
Exactly. Absolutely. So I think on a geological level, or in that case, for the oceans, Dr. Sylvia Earle has identified those and has named them hope spots, which I think is so beautiful because we are also leading with solutions for planet Earth. So to basically always create a positive goal that actually we can create a shared collaboration around. And our wish is to help stabilize those hope spots with the tools and the scientific data that we're generating.
So let's get a little bit more deep into what these tools provide, because it's one thing, first of all, we can't impact something that we don't know about. And or we can't consciously, we do impact things that we don't consciously know about, but to make the invisible visible, it seems like that's really what you're doing, so that then we can be more responsible around it. As you're doing that, it's one thing to be able to make a challenge or an issue visible. It's another to be able to create interventions or remediations. And you said that ultimately we're looking at the technology that you're developing to be able to do predictive work as well.
Yes.
And so when I met you, you were doing a presentation, and something from that presentation absolutely rocked my world. And that was the example of an organization that wanted to put solar collection all over the Sahara Desert, and your predictive model showed that it would destroy the rainforest. So I was so moved and so impacted by that I'd love you to talk about the arc of this development. First, the ability to observe and collect the data, and then the predictive capabilities and where that goes.
Absolutely. So that example, I would like to go back to that example maybe and tell it real quickly here, because it really is so indicative of how the Earth is an interconnected system. And if we're just counting single metrics,
as
like,
well-meaning as they may be, right?
absolutely well-meaning, but if they don't connect, it's like a piece of a puzzle that you hold, but you don't have the bigger picture. So if you don't have the picture, this puzzle piece that you have may be valuable, but in that moment, it's still not valuable to you, right? So we need to actually create a shared unified framework so that then every single piece of data point, metric, or research is now fitting and enlarging or getting us closer to the bigger picture, right? And
What I'm hearing is that you're essentially decoding the butterfly effect.
yes, I mean, that would be very high.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we will ever get there, to be honest, as humanity, to decode the butterfly effect, but it's an infinite approximation to actually understand complexity and complex dynamic systems. Yes. And we're not going to get there if we actually only count in verticals. So the example with the Sahara is actually very, very exciting. And I love to tell that story because it's just so mind-blowing. It's these German engineers, I think it was German engineers, and they basically created this model, said, hey, if we would deploy it was like covering the entire Saharan desert with solar panels, they could actually power several European countries. And it just made so much sense. And everybody was applauding, and this is really great idea. And then luckily, and it wasn't us, it was actually someone at NASA JPL. And that was possible with satellites. What we're going to do in the future, you need the ground data for. But that luckily was, somebody was able to create Earth systems models only using satellites. And what happened there is that they actually saw from space, they saw how the Amazon rainforest is generating every day by doing photosynthesis. Every day it's generating the energy that's equivalent of just hundreds of thousands of hydrogen bombs per day. Just that alone is so astounding that we actually have an organism that is able to generate energy that we have such a hard time generating, right? And with that energy, it lifts 10 times the amount of the Amazon River, the water, into the air. And there it creates those cloud rivers, and those are creating a microclimate so powerful that it actually governs the winds of the northern and southern hemisphere. And with those winds, it creates every day a wind tunnel over the ocean to the Saharan desert, pulls Saharan desert over the ocean, every day tons and tons of sand flying over the ocean through the atmosphere. And then the sand is being distributed over the entire Amazon rainforest because the phosphor in the Sahara sand is fertilizing the Amazon rainforest. In other words, if those solar panels would have been set up and would have covered the Sahara, the sand wouldn't have been, the flow of sand would have been interrupted. The Amazon wouldn't get fertility in its soil any longer. The ecosystem would collapse. And then it would be interesting to look further, because I saw some calculations that indicated, I'm not sure, but indicated that there would be huge tsunamis in the ocean because the Amazon is a big regulator, right? So all those ecosystems are connected.
extraordinary. So take us into ÄRTH's model, and what kinds of things are you mapping? And then how does this move into a predictive model? And then lastly, how does it move into a regenerative, actionable model?
Yes, very well put. All right, so this is where machine learning is really helpful, is if you have a lot of data pieces, but you don't quite understand the patterns and how they're linked. This is where machine learning is really valuable, right? So what we're doing is we're creating the conditions for machine learning to do that for us. So in the first step, what we're doing is creating digital twins or biomimetic models, by incentivizing all those different data streams coming from all those different ocean institutions And now it's important that this data is normalized, that this data is regularly updating. So we actually have a, a real time or learning effect. This data is flowing in, and now we're using machine learning. And we have also created ontologies and graphs that basically relate all the different data points to each other. And now a model can start learning more and more over time. The more the data updates, the more it starts learning how the ecosystem actually behaves, the bioregional ecosystem behaves in its specificity, right? But we can also now from that extract a general rule set that you can now apply to another bioregion and another coast and another coast. And you basically modify from the general rule set, you modify the differences in data inputs. And now you have a learning model that over time can help. For example, the US coast has been horribly eroded because of, bad practices due to shrimp farming and all these things that should have been monitored way, like long time ago. A good coast, what does a reef do? It stops a wave, right? If you have a very strong wave because of strong winds, what the reef does, it slows down the wave. So when the wave arrives at the shore, it doesn't go on. But because of the erosion of the reefs, now a normally good wave is going 50 miles inward, taking everything in its way, creating so much destruction. That's what we're seeing in Miami and Florida, including, the crazy hurricanes and weather events. So all this together, it's a really bad combination. That is because of the erosion of the coasts, right? So the first response was to say, hey, let's call the Navy and let's build concrete dams and let's put sand everywhere because the wave is the enemy and we need to stop the wave. Okay, cool. The wave didn't care, it just washed over those. Maybe it stopped it a little, but not significantly, not enough. And so now insurance companies, even in the US, are now lobbying for nature-based solutions because nobody can pay those premiums any longer. And now they're even, saying, okay, we should actually know how to rebuild our reef. And so now what happens? People are looking at other places and are saying, well, let's see how those guys rebuild their reefs and how those guys rebuild their reefs. Well, then you try to copy it on your reef and it doesn't work because your reef is different, right? So this is where our tool over time will eventually learn from coast to coast and will basically give very fast optimal monitoring and optimal results, helping scientists to assess much faster what needs to be done, but also to actually drive numbers behind the value of actually nature-based solutions, which I think is, to me, one of the most important things. Yesterday, I got a call again from somebody who wanted to know everything about carbon sequestration technologies. There's a lot of money in those. I understand they're very valuable because there's no indication that we stop emitting. On the contrary, we're emitting more CO2 than ever, which really shows how all the efforts and frameworks that have been put forth by countries, protocols, have not reduced emissions whatsoever, which is really worrisome, right? So now the jump forward is to say, hey, let's build these huge machines that are sucking out CO2. Yes, great, but we still need to regenerate nature, because without that, we don't have food security. We don't have coastal protection from floods. We cannot stop saltwater intruding into our freshwater systems. Ecosystems do so much more than storing carbon. That's why we need them.
And I think the notion of storing carbon is just so oversimplified. It's not looking at
It's like a tiny piece of sand.
Right. It's not looking at the system. So that brings us to the next conversation. You talked about how this can be predictive. I want to talk about revenue, because you just talked about the value of biodiversity and the natural environment, and how even when insurance companies are trying to support conservation or regeneration, we know that there's some kind of monetary factor there. And I wanted to talk to you about the model that you have, the financial model, and biodiversity credits versus carbon credits. And I had never heard of biodiversity credits before our conversation. So I'd love it if you would jump into that, because this is sort of key to how you're going to be able to fund this massive global effort.
Yes. All right. I think what happened recently is in the last years, we have seen that carbon credits have been highly criticized because they are not necessarily an indicator that the intervention that has been funded through carbon credits has necessarily produced a positive impact. It has in many examples and instances it has, but it is really, really hard to monitor and keep tabs on it. So the question, so what bears the question?
I just want to interrupt to say the interventions can often do damage, not only not create benefit, but do damage, because you're planting invasive trees, for instance, in an ecosystem where they don't belong, or yeah, so on and on, beyond the greenwashing aspect.
Absolutely. I think even well-intentioned, we just don't know enough. So ultimately, I've seen a lot of funding going into projects where there just wasn't enough information to even assess impact. In order to have that information, we just need to have a better knowledge on how ecosystems work in order to actually know if something can be impactful or not, right? And I think that's where the philosopher in me comes in, and it's like, wait, if there's no knowledge base, on what basis are you investing? Are you impact investing? And so, for example, the Ashaninka in the Amazon rainforest, they know how to bring back dead soil. They basically go around, and where, you know, soil has been left completely depleted from like grazing or soy farms, and then people move on and cut a new piece of the Amazon rainforest because that one is already dead. What the Ashaninka do is they go in and they plant 137 seeds, different species seeds, because they have identified each species of seed needed to bring back the biome, to bring back that worm, to grow a tree, and then this tree is giving shade to that tree. They have understood the entire ecosystem and how to basically regenerate soil. If we don't have that knowledge, what are we doing in planting trees? Right? And so the same is true for the oceans. We need to understand, it's great if we break coral, we break branching coral, and we have fast successes because now the coral is sprawling everywhere and growing. But we've created a clone of the same coral. So one disease wipes out the entire reef system and takes the other ones with it, right? So how can we assess if an intervention is truly creating a positive impact or not? Because you wouldn't want to waste your money. And this is where the financial returns come in, right? And this is also where biodiversity assessment tools are really important. We have created an AI-driven biodiversity assessment tool that now allows to assess if an intervention is actually stabilizing or increasing biodiversity or not. And there's a new conversation to basically link carbon credits to biodiversity, saying, hey, cool, you have a carbon storage here. And it is actually carbon that is embedded in a healthy ecosystem. And how do we know the ecosystem is healthy? Because there is biodiversity. And so now there's biodiversity credits. There's a premium credit if they have like co-benefits. If you have a blue carbon credit or a carbon credit that has biodiversity metrics behind it, you can sell it for way more, right? So those metrics are important, and we are making sure that the metrics that are coming from us are based on scientific institutes' data, that they're vetted by large oceanographic institutes and scientists, and we can scale it because we actually have created an AI-driven biodiversity assessment tool for reef and coastal systems that can do that at scale.
This is super exciting to me, because I have the notion of reducing the health of our environment to something as
One data
basic.
point.
I mean, as carbon, it's like that can't possibly be what's going to make the difference in our survival. And what you're talking about with biodiversity credits is really putting the emphasis on life as an indicator of health, not carbon or lack of carbon.
It's not us who's doing that, though. I do have to say that it's the UN. It's the UN, but what they're doing is they're putting out the framework for biodiversity credit. What we are doing is we're providing the validation through metrics that are coming from ocean institutions on the ground that validate that that carbon credit is really truly retired and truly has the impact we're all wishing for.
I love it, because what's the point of the carbon credit in the first place is life, not carbon, right? So people got so myopic around the whole thing. And so it's very refreshing to me to hear that you're validating biodiversity credits. Pretty remarkable. So what happens in terms of funding your organization? How does that work with the biodiversity credits? Because here's the thing, there's so many wonderful efforts that are being done and that are being made globally that are not funded. And one of the beautiful things about this is that you have a built-in way to be able to fund your organization and regenerate the planet ultimately, you know, with
Yes.
it, to fund this incredibly huge vision and to help restore the earth. So how does that work?
Well, I think my big wish is for, there's so many innovators, it's incredible. Like once you start, people are, it's easy to get depressed when you listen to what's in the media and then you read the reports by the IPCC and how bleak everything is and the global warming and the emissions. But then once you start spending time with people on the ground and on location, it's incredible how resilient nature is and how, I spent time with like the Brazilian NGOs and they drove out with me to look at the humpback whales and they showed me how I think they quadrupled in the last years, they quadrupled the population and nature is so rewarding. People like John D. Liu, which I'm such a fan of this person. I mean, he's been like going around and while we're speaking, he's regenerating an entire plateau somewhere. And those people they have to fight for funding and they're still doing it all the time because nature is so rewarding. And when you see how nature is coming back, you actually become more hopeful. So we're hoping that with our tools, we can actually show the value of nature-based solutions by actually showing the value of ecosystem contribution to the GDP, showing how nature is worth when it's healthy and alive rather than when it's dead. And by that, we can actually put a value, like, the value like Ningaloo Reef is contributing. And that's just a tiny partial calculation, but I think it's already contributing, 100 million per year to the GDP of Western Australia.
Wow.
And I do need to double check the numbers, but it was pretty high in that in that area. And we don't really put a value on nature. We have only calculate nature of how valuable it is when we extract it, but not how it's contributing. And if we can do that, we can actually show how somebody who's regenerating, what the contribution of that group is. And then we can actually drive, you can make nature-based solutions valuable.
So through the vetting, I first of all, what you're saying is so incredibly important. I don't want to skirt over it, that we need to start recognizing the value of nature that is natural, that's not being extracted or
Well,
or
alive. Yeah.
is alive, that nature, we haven't been oriented to recognizing the value of this vast and amazing world that we live in. So because we monetize everything, so we have to figure out how to make that translation. But the thing that I am so fascinated by, that I think is super powerful about what you're setting up, is that you are providing a service. Your organization is going to be, one of the products is a service, and the service is vetting these biodiversity credits. And so for every credit sold that is vetted by your organization, you will receive some revenue that
We take a
can
percentage. Yeah.
say that again.
We take a percentage of the sale of the credit, right?
And
So
it's
we
a nominal percentage. So
Mhm.
you, through that will fund further research, which
Exactly.
is beautiful.
Yes.
And we're running to the end of our time. I could talk to you forever, Adina. There's so much more, so many more questions I'd love to ask. Hopefully we can create
We'll do it
another,
again.
to do it again.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if in the last few minutes that we have together, if there is anything I should have asked you that I didn't, that we want to squeeze in a few minutes.
I think no, that's okay. Otherwise, we'd be opening up a whole new chapter of all the
Well,
possibilities.
so next time we definitely need to reconvene. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your crazy, insanely huge vision, and for the amazing courage and dedication that it's taken for you to bring it into reality. You're doing just this one woman led crusade. I'm just so impressed, and
What an incredible team. I mean, it's the
that
most
you've
beautiful.
assembled, that
Yeah.
you have assembled. So and yes, I appreciate that you have an amazing team, but let's give credit to your
Thank you.
clarity and dedication. So I just really appreciate you for that. And being a woman in this space, it has its own perils and pitfalls. That's a whole other conversation we could have. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I also want to say thank you to you, all our listeners, for holding hope, for being active, for being engaged in the world, and sharing out this information. And I want to thank you also for the support that you provide Sustainability Now. And also thank you to Scott Billy, who is our partner in crime here at Sustainability Now, who's also our producer. And that's it for today. So until next time, live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.